Sego, if you like what we're doing here, if you support the show and you want to give support to the show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. And if you do so, we'll provide you some exclusive content and some things that others aren't going to get when you get it. So support us by going to Patreon. Yahweh.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Native. Today, Fed wreck in Hawaii. You know, I've talked about this issue before, and we need to talk about it again because during the Obama administration, and in fact, even going before Obama, there was an effort by the Hawaiian, the senators from Hawaii. Was it Inouye? Yeah, I guess it would be. And Daniel Akako and Daniel Inouye. They thought that the best way to accommodate Native Hawaiians was to turn them into Indians. So this idea of redefining and what a Hawaiian, a Native Hawaiian was, they just figured, well, we've been doing this Indian model for so long, we'll just plug them into that. The problem is that Native Hawaiians weren't crazy about this idea. And so a battle kind of has ensued. And this was one of the priorities that Obama tried to push through. Now, this is Obama, Biden with Sally Jewell as the Interior Secretary. They actually had a whole series of hearings, across Hawaii, and they did it on I don't know if every island, but there was I think a dozen or maybe 15 hearings that they had, where they brought in somebody from the Interior Department to have this basically hear from the people. And the overwhelming majority, and I mean almost nobody who showed up at these hearings, and you have to understand, some of these places of Hawaii don't exactly have, highways, delivering people to these, to these hearing sites. So some of these people had to, pack up and make a day of it, travel over rough roads, coming from some of the remote places that they lived to even attend these things. And there were some really, really impassioned comments from the public, and most of them all came down to this whole thing about you don't send the Interior Department here, you send the State Department here. We're a nation, we're a kingdom, and that's where a lot of the conversation kept coming back to. And so these hearings could not have been more clear about the sentiment of the Hawaiian people, the people who live in Hawaii. Now, I got to say, they actually had hearings on the continent as well. So in some of these areas where they had these Hawaiian civic organizations, places like Las Vegas and San Antonio, many of the major cities where there's a fairly, robust Hawaiian population. Ironically, they decided they would try to host these hearings at Native casinos. It's almost like we're gonna even cast this thing in terms of the venue in these lavish casino atmospheres to try to convince the Hawaiians that this was best for them. But even the hearings that were held on the continent side really all demonstrated the same thing. Now, the way that the Obama administration offset this, they said, well, we're not only going to have these hearings, but we're going to have, we're going to be receiving comments from the public, from Hawaiians via email. And As it turns out, they put very, very little weight to the people who would actually take time out of their lives, travel to these hearings, give their impassioned testimony. They put more weight on what they called their letter writing. And many of these were like, they were like form letters that people were told to, just sign them. And so when the Obama administration offered their assessment on the comment period, they said, "Oh, we had an overwhelming majority of people who wanted wanted federal recognition for Native Hawaiians, tantamount, kind of like an Indian tribe." And of course, that wasn't even true. And they put much more weight on the letter writing than they did on human beings going to a microphone at a hearing. So, this is where the tension was. Now, Obama didn't pull off what he was trying to do, which was to turn 500,000 Hawaiians into essentially Indians by the definition of the United States. He didn't pull it off. But it might be a good time for me to kind of walk this back a little bit. And let me talk a little bit about what FedRec is and how it came to be. Of course, we as Native people, just like the people of Hawaii, we existed before white people showed up. we had our governments, we had our culture, we had all of the things that you would associate with a distinct sovereign people before the first white person showed up. And when white people did show up, we maintained that for against tremendous odds. Against pressure by the churches, pressure by by militaries. Whether from a Native standpoint, we saw massacres by the Dutch, by the French, by the English, by the Americans, and there were countries like Germany who sent in soldiers to participate in some of these battles. I mean, the amount of European aggression that Native people felt in our homelands was incredible. It was just absolutely. Oh, I left out Spain. Did I leave out Spain? How could I leave out Spain? Yeah, Spain was among the most aggressive, and so this is what the experience was. Now, as much as our people experienced genocide for over 500 years, and when I say our people, I mean Native people, people indigenous to the lands of this, what people call the Western Hemisphere. That still doesn't include Hawaii, because Hawaii is not part of is not part of this. I don't even know if they were actually considered part of this hemisphere. But anyway, what we experienced in terms of this genocide, we survived it. Not all of our people did. We lost. Our population was probably eliminated to the tune of 95%, at least 95%. By some estimates, as high as 98%. In the 1930s, our population was down to like 300,000. Total number of Native people living in the continental United States down to 300,000. And that may have been down from, by some estimates, 100 million Native people, reduced down to 300,000. And I think at the lowest point, it was down to 250,000. So we were talking about a people who, yes, we did survive, but barely. And so how would we survive? And what would be left of the people who did survive? Well, many of us survived by withdrawing and having very little to do with the United States, with the states, and that kind of thing. But one of the things that I think is interesting is, how did the United States characterize us? Well, in the U.S. Constitution, we are mentioned 3 times. We were mentioned in, I think, Article 1 of the Constitution in the apportionment clause for both a fixed tax and direct tax, I should say, and for representation in Congress. And we're mentioned in there. We're mentioned when they talk about that these taxes and representation shall be apportioned according to the number of all free persons. And then including in that number, they said 3/5 of and when I say all free persons, they also meant people who were only termed in some sort of indentured servitude, but they were still considered free persons, I guess. But they said in 3/5 of all others, meaning slaves, but excluding, and they defined us as Indians not taxed. So we weren't, and of course, none of us were taxed. So I mean, I don't understand the not taxed. That's not really that well explained. But again, excluding Indians not taxed. So we were not part of the U.S. Constitution. We were not represented by Congress. We were not included in the apportionment for taxation or for representation. And that's the U.S. Constitution. So after the Civil War, when the 14th Amendment is passed, after the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, they passed the 14th Amendment, which is supposed to clear up the citizenship issue, but it was really directed towards former slaves. And it basically says that all persons born within the continental United States and under U.S. jurisdiction are considered U.S. citizens. That didn't include us. For one thing, many of us were still born or lived on our lands, which was still not firmly established as part of the United States, and still isn't to this day. But we certainly weren't under their jurisdiction. So the 14th Amendment didn't apply to us either. So we, in 1868, we still were separate and distinct from the United States and from United States citizenship. So this actually causes some trouble, especially when it comes to the United States and their so-called trust responsibility to Native people that they took on with certain land transactions, cessions of lands and that kind of thing. But there was always this question: well, what is the status of a Native person, as far as the United States is concerned? But it was never really cleared up. In 1924, the United States passes the Indian Citizenship Act. And in this act, without application, without, us asking, through treaty or request of any form, the United States passes a law and says that they declared, and this was the House and the Senate, so Congress declared that all Native people born in the United States are U.S. citizens. There's a proviso in there that says nothing in this act shall affect our tribal property or our personal or tribal property, whatever that's supposed to mean. Well, I don't know what tribal property is or possessions. But so they passed this thing in 1924, but we didn't ask for it. And frankly, in 1924, and I've talked about this on the show before, in 1924, this idea of a country stripping away a people's national character or cultural character, and then implanting theirs upon or imposing their national character or culture or whatever on them. The rest of the world was already calling this a war crime, a prosecutable war crime. And this was based on some of what was happening in Europe. The idea of elimination, this idea of ethnically cleansing, regions of Europe, primarily Europe. So while the world is calling this very act a war crime, the United States is just, no, we're all in, we're doing this. And of course, the United States was under no scrutiny. I mean, the United States was already getting away in 1924. And we'll go back and talk about Hawaii in a moment. But the United States is already getting away literally with murder, but also with genocide in any measure of it. But in 1924, the word genocide didn't exist yet. But denationalization, which essentially is the precursor to what would be called genocide later on, denationalization was considered a war crime. But that's exactly what the United States did in 1924. I mean, the sad part is many Native people today will cite 1924, oh, that's when we got to be U.S. citizens. No, you didn't get to be. They just declared, they just tried to make you. So you had to decide, as far as I'm concerned, we all have to decide, do we accept that imposition of U.S. citizenship, or do we try to maintain our distinction as Native people? And I'll get into how those things are mutually exclusive. But so that's 1924. Now, in 1934, they passed the Indian Reorganization Act because they know they haven't really solved the problem with their whole Citizenship Act from 10 years before that. They know they haven't solved the problem. So they passed this Indian Reorganization Act. And what this does is it clears up how the United States defines a quote unquote Indian. I mean, it's sole intent. Some of the intentions of the law was to create a little more self-governance. Don't even throw the word sovereignty into this, but self-governance and self-determination. Now, the problem is this law required Native peoples to vote whether to accept and to be an IRA, an Indian Reorganization Act people or not. And what came along with that was clear oversight by the federal government in terms of its Interior Department, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the like. But it also had in its agenda, even though they talked about this idea of self-governance, they wanted to define what that government was. So what the Bureau of Indian Affairs was going to be charged with is creating constitutions for all of these nations that wanted to accept the Indian Reorganization Act. So essentially eliminating traditional governance. Now, many native territories rejected this, and some of them didn't say one way or the other, but the assumption was that once this law was passed, that the United States could redefine. Now, in redefining what a native person was, it was really clear what they were saying. They said the United States recognizes their Indians as tribes, bands, or nations of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. So that's 1934. Now, there's nothing that suggests, even with the passage of that law, that Native people consented to it. So this idea that any Native territories consented to being subordinate to the laws of the United States is it's a huge assumption. It's an imposition that only one side of the ledger is checked off, and that's the United States. So that's the definition of a Native person today, a Native American or American Indian, as the United States defines us, is a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. So they took the word nation and they reduced it to being a synonym to a tribe or a band. So again, this whole idea of nationhood, to be clear, they weren't recognizing Native peoples as nation states, because what they were characterizing Native peoples as were subordinate to the laws of the United States. So essentially, this was to try to put a more solid stamp on the Indian Citizenship Act and saying Native people are Americans, but we're going to allow them to be organized as Native peoples, and be members of those organizations. We're going to recognize their membership of their tribal enrollment. But to be clear, they're U.S. citizens. So that's what came in 1934. So, all right, now let's back up to Hawaii again. So in 1893, the United States illegally occupies Hawaii. The Hawaiian Kingdom is recognized throughout the world. Since 1848, the Hawaiian Kingdom has been internationally recognized as an independent, sovereign state. In fact, in Hawaii, they actually celebrate the day that Europe, first made this distinction, and they call it their Independence Day. I've talked to some Hawaiian people, and as much as they want to celebrate that day, the idea of that being their Independence Day is totally inaccurate, because they didn't win their independence in 1848. They were already an independent. What that was an acknowledgement. I mean, they should call it Recognition Day or something else. I don't know, but it is celebrated by Hawaiian people and in Hawaii as their Independence Day, when the rest of the world recognized them. And it's interesting because this would be the first nation state that the European, the international community, which was really kind of based out of Europe, that would be recognized, that had not been colonized and had not been under some sort of European rule at some point. This was the first nation state that would enjoy that distinction. So, but in 19 or in before the end of the century, the United States would just say, no, we're taking it. And how did that happen? Well, it happened because the Hawaiian Kingdom did allow non-Native Hawaiians to become Hawaiian subjects. So if you were born in Hawaii, whether you're white or not, I mean, or Native Hawaiian or not, you could be registered as a Hawaiian subject. So there were other countries also that had some of their nationals who lived in Hawaii, including Japan, China, other places, and once those people, had children, and I assume they could have become Hawaiian subjects without being born there. I don't know exactly, but there would come a time that there would be many other ethnicities living in Hawaii that were Hawaiian subjects, but again, were not necessarily Native Hawaiians. And as money would pour into Hawaii, especially for agriculture, the Dole family, we still know Dole pineapples and bananas today. That family would end up having a huge investment, especially in sugar production. So there would be a lot of non-Native Hawaiian subjects living in Hawaii, and their financial interests were always geared towards the relationship with the United States. And you would actually see what now is defined as gentrification. Native Hawaiians were being gentrified in their own homelands by Americans, Europeans, Asians, and others. So that's how you would have a situation where you would have wealthy white men backed by the United States that would simply say, we're taking over Hawaii. It wasn't necessarily the United States at first, but they would use the fact that there was a Hawaiian marine vessel there, a naval vessel there. And they literally held the queen hostage, and they took over the Kingdom of Hawaii and said, the Kingdom of Hawaii is no more. Us white men, we're forming the Republic of Hawaii. And they were backed by the military of the United States to do this. Now, this was not necessarily widely accepted by everybody, but it didn't invoke the international outrage that it should have. And so this crew of white men who had taken over basically had, it was a coup against the Hawaiian Kingdom, and they would replace the kingdom with their new form of government. This was really an international scandal. In fact, the United States, through the U.S. President Grover Cleveland, really had some problems with this, and he wanted to back the Queen to regain the kingdom. His concern was he didn't want all of these Americans who were Hawaiian subjects to be executed for treason. As this whole thing would play out, the kingdom would never be restored, and then there would be an attempt by this crew of white men to ask to be annexed, ask for for Hawaii to be annexed by the United States. Now, they weren't even recognized as a legitimate government, and there was no proper any kind of referendum or anything else that would justify this request for annexation. So the annexation treaty was rejected. It never did. It was never accepted by the president of the United States. It was never confirmed through the I think the supermajority of the Senate. None of that stuff. But what did happen is that through a joint resolution of Congress, and I think this was through the President William McKinley, they decided, no, we're just going to take Hawaii. We are going to annex Hawaii without an annexation treaty and without the process laid out in the U.S. Constitution. So through a simple majority and through a joint resolution of Congress, which isn't supposed to have this kind of legal or legislative weight, they just illegally occupied Hawaii. So that's what transpired in the late 19th century, and that's how the United States would come to claim the Hawaii, basically undermine the Hawaiian Kingdom and take over Hawaii. Now, for a couple of generations since then, most of the Hawaiian people were not taught the truth. I mean, I think many of the Hawaiian people at the time, as much as they protested and they actually signed petitions demanding that, to have the kingdom restored, that effort would fade, and it would essentially be lost into the dustbin of history, so to speak. But in the 70s, when the native sovereignty movement began to really kick up a lot of stir over a lot of these issues, the people of Hawaii would relearn this history. So that's what we'll talk about. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about the sovereignty movement as it comes into Hawaii and how it brings us to where we're at now. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Hey, I want to give a shout out and a thanks to my sponsors, Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric Whitney and ERW Enterprises, and the good folks at Grand River Enterprises. They are our main sponsors, and of course, I also extend my gratitude to those who help out from time to time, guys like Ed and Cindy and our guys who provided us with a brand new microphone, Julian, Travis, and Jake. I want to thank all of you guys for supporting the program. All right, let me get back to it. So once we come out of, both the civil rights, era and then the sovereignty movement, native sovereignty pushback out of the 70s, more and more Hawaiians started becoming more aware of how badly they were duped. And it's not a completely bloodless coup, by the way. There were acts of violence, and of course the racism that the Native Hawaiian people were already feeling before this coup would only increase under more and more U.S. rule. And of course, their economies would be shifted towards, completely taken over by, American investment and other foreign investment to change, what their crops were, what their trade was going to be. I mean, Hawaii became inundated both from a tourism standpoint, and I can't leave out the fact that there was a naval vessel there in the first place was already showing how much the U.S. was beginning to use Hawaii for military purposes. And that's essentially part of the reason that the annexation or this illegal occupation would happen in the first place. The United States was beginning its imperialism beyond the continent of North America and pushing not only into Hawaii, but the Spanish-American War would ensue, and Hawaii would be a big part of being the naval base, Pearl Harbor, the naval base for the United States. I mean, so this is all part of what was built up. But the Hawaiian people became aware of this now, and it almost seems, it would seem strange to many people that there would have been several generations that just completely became silent on this issue. But the current generations and the more recent generations were not so much. And so this idea of learning about this became a big part of who they were, and asserting who they are as a Kanaka as distinct Hawaiian people. Now, during the Clinton administration in 1993, there would actually be what was considered the apology resolution. And this was, again, a joint resolution of Congress, although this one was passed by more than a simple majority. The House and the Senate would pass this resolution acknowledging the wrongdoing that the United States had committed against Hawaii in the toppling of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And this was signed by the U.S. President Clinton. And so this was like an acknowledgement that the Hawaiian people have been wrong. No reparations involved here, although there has been efforts through various means and funding mechanisms to create some level of recognizing the distinction of Hawaiian people. Now, and this is where it starts to get murky, because even things that were being put in place that were geared towards perhaps, lands and land use and homes, some people are saying, this might be violating the U.S. Constitution to treat Hawaiian people different than other American citizens. And so this began the effort to say the way we can protect Hawaiian people is if we recognize them in the same way that American Indians are recognized. So this whole idea of FedRec, and I do spell it FEDWRECK, and I actually, it's always been referred to loosely as FedRec, as in with REC, but understanding the destruction that comes along with federal recognition, both from Native people here in the within the continent, I would say, and what was being suggested to or recommended for the Hawaiian people. It was clear that this was about destroying something and trying to sweeten it enough to lure Hawaiian people into the whole thing. Now, one of the things that I have to address with this whole myth of federal recognition is that this allows Native people to have dual citizenship. This is one I just addressed this week on a Facebook post. This whole idea of dual citizenship, we pretend that that's a real thing, but it isn't. I mean, the United States doesn't recognize us as citizens of our nations. No, they don't. I mean, they don't. They won't recognize our right to produce a passport or any of that stuff. So what they recognize us as are members of tribal organizations. Remember that I told you the whole idea of the Indian Reorganization Act was about allowing us to organize, not to become nation states, but to organize. So, and organize under their parameters for organization, basically. So the United States doesn't recognize me as a citizen of the Mohawk Nation. In fact, they don't even recognize the Mohawk Nation. What they did is they come up with these mechanisms to recognize tribes, and those tribes, in fact, they would split up nations. So you'd have the St. Regis Mohawk tribe in Akwesasne. Of course, that's actually the only group of Mohawks that the federal government recognizes through their recognition process. Look, they recognize us as Mohawks. They have to, because we're still here. But they don't recognize us as these tribes that they tried to create with the Indian Reorganization Act. And what they did with others, like the Oneidas, for instance, there's the Oneida Indians of New York, and then there's the Oneida tribe of Wisconsin. They've done this with so many distinct Native peoples, where they created the parameters for what they would be recognized in terms of their tribe. And of course, part of this would also be driven by the fact that we are split up geographically, through the removal periods and pushing us into different areas, and whether we all went or didn't go. Seneca Nation, for instance, you got the Seneca Nation of Indians, Seneca Nation, then you got the Tonawanda Band of Senecas, and then out in Kansas, I think there's the Cayuga Senecas, or Seneca Cayugas. So, I mean, this is how convoluted this whole idea of federal recognition. It doesn't just recognize and reduce somebody from a nation down to a tribe. It starts to separate it, which is also part of the plan with Hawaii, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But so when Obama was in office with Biden as his vice president and Sally Jewell as the Interior Secretary, there became this big push to try to create a streamlined process that would just flip a switch and turn Native Hawaiians, 500,000 people who identify themselves as Native Hawaiians, turn them into federally recognized tribes, Hawaiian tribes. Now, it wasn't necessarily going to create one. There was already conversation about how they would recognize tribes in each island, and they would separate. So there could have been as many as a dozen Native Hawaiian tribes. It would still be 500,000 people in total, but they would be, sometimes pitted against each other for funding and for resources and that kind of stuff. It was going to be a complete debacle. And By and large, the vast majority of Hawaiian people opposed it. Now, not all of them did, though. Some saw the opportunity in this thing. Oh, we could become a tribal organization and get federal funding, and we would be able to create all these, these businesses and business opportunities. We would be able to, again, millions and millions of dollars are tied in with federal recognition. And there were opportunistic people, some who were perhaps already had some familiarity with the way the federal recognition system worked with Native people, Native Americans, as we were called. So there were a lot of carpetbaggers, even amongst the Native Hawaiian population, who said, "Yeah, we want this. We want this." The overwhelming majority of people rejected it. Now, keep in mind, while this conversation about Fed Rec, yes or yay or nay, is going on, there is still a growing movement for the restoration of the Hawaiian kingdom. And that gets twisted into this thing. And, some are saying, well, yeah, this would be a step towards getting the Hawaiian kingdom recognized. No, it isn't. This would be totally undermining and gutting that, because there is nothing there's no part of federal recognition as a tribe that could be viewed as a pathway to recognition as a nation state. So the effort of, some of these really dedicated and committed people who have done everything from, bringing out the Kue petitions for, that showed the resistance to the annexation in the first place, and protesting right from the beginning. There's so much effort in terms of education, traveling the world. Some of these guys, Leon Su and some of these guys who have traveled, Keanu Sai, traveled the world to say, look, you countries, you let us down. You recognized the Hawaiian kingdom, and you did nothing while the United States illegally occupied us. So this is the kind of thing that had been going on. And there were scholars, and there were legal scholars, international lawyers who looked at this and said, the Hawaiian kingdom, the Hawaiian people have a right, a legitimate right. I mean, there was even a period of time where the UN was involved in decolonization. The idea that countries in South America and Africa that were colonized by European powers or American powers, no, take it back. Only European powers. The United States was never the subject of any of this decolonization. Well, I guess we could argue that once the Philippines would become independent from the United States after they took it from the Spanish, we could argue that, I guess. But Hawaii was never on the radar. So this is the effort that's been going on. So while there's a conversation over here about whether Native Hawaiians should accept being reduced to a tribe, and then the others who saw the opportunity in that, while that conversation is going on, there's another conversation that's happening with people who are becoming very well educated and charged about the restoration of the Hawaiian kingdom. And those two things they are mutually exclusive. And again, I'll go back to this idea of dual citizenship. This would not create an opportunity for Hawaiians to still make the case for being Hawaiian kingdom subjects and be U.S. citizens. No, it's either or. I mean, you can't do both. And this is where Native people throughout the world, indigenous people throughout the world are struggling. Even with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it stays away from the idea of any of us reclaiming our nationhood, to become nation states. It avoids that completely. And in fact, if anything, the only time the word sovereignty is even mentioned in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is when they're trying to assure nation states who are being compelled to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. Nothing in this declaration was meant to infringe on their sovereignty. Everything's been about infringing on ours, but nothing in the declaration was intended to challenge the sovereignty of nation states that have indigenous peoples still living amongst them. So this is where this whole thing had gotten convoluted because there were people trying to mix messages. They were trying to say, well, if we get recognized, federally recognized, and they never they never complete that sentence. They never say, if we get recognized as a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States, then what? Because you can't complete that sentence and say, well, if we get recognized as a tribe, then we can still use that as a pathway to be recognized as a nation? No, that's not the way it works. I mean, we are still in the midst of many challenges on, across the continent, and U.S. and Canada, on what it means to be a Native person. And our identities have been trampled upon. Look, we are mocked with things like mascots. We have politicians who just absolutely cannot recognize that we don't consider ourselves Americans. I mean, there was a major demonstration, there have been major demonstrations in Hawaii where the signs were held up, and in fact, I posted some on my Facebook page. We are not Americans. That's what the Hawaiian people are saying. We are not Americans. Well, if you accept federal recognition as a tribe, that's exactly what they're going. See, this whole effort, and they're going to throw some, they're going to put some sugar to this. They're going to say, look, there's funding involved. We know that we can protect, the crown lands that you're still trying to maintain. We know that we can do all of these things if you're recognized as a tribe, because we can hold that land in trust for you. Yeah, that's what they claim to do for Native people in the U.S. and Canada, that they're holding our land for our use, that they hold it, that they own the title to it. Well, see, that's what's being offered up here. And, of course, they're talking about, all the upsides to being a tribe. Well, if you go across the United States, you only have to see that we top every list you don't want to be on top. The highest suicide rate, the highest poverty rate, the highest unemployment rate. Look, and every one of these things that I'm saying, that's what the Hawaiian people are experiencing now in Hawaii. The Kanaka Maoli are experiencing all of these things: drug and alcohol abuse, teen pregnancy, poverty, unemployment, the shortest life expectancy. All of those things that we experience with this idea of federal recognition and the trust responsibility of the United States, we experience all these things. But that's what the Hawaiian people are experiencing today: homelessness. Now, keep in mind, when I talk about 500,000 people that would identify themselves as Native Hawaiians, only about 25 to 30% of them live in Hawaii. Why is that? Why would they leave their homeland? Because they were forced to, because of poverty. Look, you have a high incidence of homelessness in Hawaii, but many of those people could not afford to live there. Why? Because the tourism industry and the military industrial complex that took over Hawaii. It forced everything skyrocketing. Look, if you're in the military, then you get a housing allowance, whatever that is going to be. If it's well above what a Native Hawaiian could afford, well, that's not your problem. You're military. So it drove up the cost of housing, and of course, there's also other perks that come with being military in terms of commissary and what you can buy, and meantime, the price of everything else is going up. People don't realize that this thing called the Jones Act means that everything that goes into Hawaii has to come to the mainland, has to come to the continent first. Same thing with Puerto Rico. So you would think a territory that's in the middle of the Pacific, right along trade routes, you would think, man, they would have a lot of cheap stuff coming their way, especially that close to Asia. No, everything that gets imported into Hawaii has to come to the mainland first. And that was some piece of legislation supposed to protect longshoremen or something like that. That means a gallon of milk costs $7 in Hawaii. So what the average person can afford in the United States, they couldn't afford it in Hawaii. That's why 70% of the population, 70% of Native Hawaiians live in the mainland. And so what would that mean with federal recognition? Would you have these large groups of tribalized, or recognized Native Hawaiians who have no land base? Because and if the belief is that once this happens, that all these Hawaiians could go back to their homeland, no, they couldn't. Their lands have been taken up, have been swallowed up. And you think some little set-asides, through a tribal, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to somehow afford these people with new homes and everything else? Look, this whole thing is a debacle. And that's why the push now under this new administration, see, this is where I think we have to really scrutinize what is going to be the Biden agenda, because it sounds to me he's picking up everything that Obama did, and this was one of them. And now you're going to have a Native person who has totally embraced federal recognition in as far as the assimilation patterns that go along with it in Deb Haaland. I have no reason to believe that she is going to recognize what the Native Hawaiians recognize, that they don't want this. So this becomes more problematic, and this effort is essentially going to start at the beginning of an administration, not somewhere in the midst where there's there's a lot of stuff going on that for the Biden administration has to address. But when they're putting their list of things together, and you can bet some of those people who are looking to cash out with federal recognition, or cash in, I should say, they're going to put this high on their priority list. And I've listened to folks like Joe Biden talk about how committed he was in working in the Senate with guys like Akaka and Inoue. So this is a major problem, and this is what the Hawaiian people are facing, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But we see all of this conflict, and look. There's all kinds of battles happening over lands and land use in Hawaii already. Not just Mauna Kea and the effort to take that what the Hawaiians consider a sacred site and build these huge telescopes there, but just basic housing. And look, there's already been a lot of corruption associated with the housing programs that were designed through what is primarily a state agency, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which is a state of Hawaii agency. And to the extent that it's tried to do some things to provide housing, you can already see it rife with corruption. I mean, some of the very people who are pushing the hardest right now for federal recognition are the ones who've been doing quite well under the state agency. And of course, it leaves Native Hawaiians, just like Native people on the continent. Should they vote in elections? Do they go along with as an American in the meantime? And what does that mean? Look, and I got into this with some folks on Facebook who were saying, well, we still see an opportunity in voting for this and voting for that. Yeah, but you're acknowledging that this imposed U.S. citizenship. How does that jive with the work to restore the Hawaiian Kingdom? And I talked to guys like Leon Siu, who was the foreign minister of the Hawaiian Kingdom, foreign affairs minister, and Keanu Sai, and some of the people who've been so instrumental in trying to push for this restoration. They're not telling people to vote in U.S. elections or Hawaiian elections. No, and so this is where this whole thing gets convoluted. And trust me, this push for FedRec is going to be pushed very, very hard, and it might be packaged up in a way that relies on the number of Hawaiian people who live on the continent side to offer them all kinds of goodies in this thing. And so what you're going to have is the Native Hawaiians, the people living in Hawaii, the people who've been endured, over a century of illegal occupation and subjugation, essentially. It's going to be a tough battle, because I think there are people living both on the U.S. on the continent side and some of the opportunistic people living in Hawaii who are going to figure this is a way to cash out. Now, the final thing I got to mention is now the whole idea of casinos is being floated around too. See, when Obama was talking about federal recognition, it was clear, or it seemed clear that this would not involve opening up casinos, because the state of Hawaii doesn't allow casinos. So according to the Cabazon ruling in 1988 or whatever it was, that there would, if the state doesn't have gaming, then the tribes can't do gaming. Now, I don't know what's happened to change that. I don't know if Hawaii adopted some new legislation as a state, but now all of a sudden there's a lot of conversation about, well, if we're federally recognized, we could open up a casino. So this is becoming, and I'm not, flat out condemning, native territories that have done casinos, but I'm not a big fan, because it turns into very much the tail wagging the dog, and we've seen it everywhere, even here in Seneca Nation. We've seen how gaming has changed government. It didn't provide all of the answers to everything people thought it would provide. If anything, it's caused even more conflict with the states. Clearly, Senecas are at war with New York State over gaming, and even with a new Native Interior Secretary, I've heard nothing that suggests that she's prepared to address the problems, of over aggressive states with Native territories doing gaming. So throw this into the mix too. Again, something that is probably being offered up to sweeten the pot, so to speak, but something that everything that I've heard from Native Hawaiians is, no, we don't want casinos. We don't want to be in the casino industry. Look, if anything, they wish they could reduce tourism. Now, granted, I know that there are Native Hawaiians who are employed in the tourism industry, but when they assess the two biggest negative impacts to their lives, and this includes the Native Hawaiians who live in the continent too, because they know what drove them off their lands. They attribute it to the tourism, the tourist industry, and the military-industrial complex that exists there. If they could have their way, they would reduce both. And frankly, if they were ever successful in restoring, if they are successful, which I hope they are, in restoring true sovereignty to the Hawaiian kingdom, I'm not saying it has to wipe out the tourism industry or the U.S. military presence there, but they certainly do need to make sure that they're paid. And look, part of leasing space, to both to the tourism industry and the military could be a large foundation of their financial independence. I know it doesn't sound so way, but it would be much better than them trying to go wholesale turning Hawaii into some sort of gaming, island, pleasure island, I guess, in terms of gaming. So this is coming down, folks. So I think, and I'm going to probably talk about this more. I'll try to get some of my friends from Hawaii to join me on future broadcasts. But this is a big one, and it was big when Obama was trying to do it, and it may be even bigger now that Biden's trying to do it. And it concerns me that there may be a Native person in the Interior Department that may be attempting to facilitate this. Well, certainly she is. Sally Jewell, she got ridiculed when she was out in Hawaii. She didn't show up at most of these hearings, but they had a representative show up. But she was not very well embraced. Like I said, they said, you send the State Department, you can keep the Interior Department. That's what the Native Hawaiians were saying. In fact, some of this got kicked off because of that very claim and that very request. So we'll keep tabs on this, and I'll keep you informed as this thing goes forward. But know that FedRec in Hawaii is not all that it's being dressed up to be by the Biden administration. So we'll see how that challenge goes. Thanks for listening. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.